All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Managing Your Own Employee Engagement Survey. My name is Stephen Shinnon. I'm the Director of Marketing at TalentMap, and I'll be your co-host today. Your host today is Sean Fitzpatrick, President and CEO of TalentMap. As a quick note, this webinar was originally advertised as having our Senior Vice President of Engagement and Norm Bailey-David as the host. However, we had a last-minute schedule conflict, but we were very pleased to have Sean step in today. Before I pass on to Sean, go through a few agenda items as well as talk a bit about TalentMap. So, of course, we're in the introduction right now. We'll follow with the steps of running a successful employee survey initiative. So we'll go through the steps themselves, what can go wrong and what you can do to solve those challenges. And then we'll give you some kind of tools of engagement, and then we'll do a wrap-up. So, you might be asking yourself, why is this full-service employee survey solution provider giving us tips for do-it-yourself survey deployment? Well, it's because we want everyone to understand the value of employee engagement. There's a lot more to surveying your employees than meets the eye, and when done improperly, it can be really costly and time-consuming. So just to give you a little bit of background about what we do, we help our clients ask the right questions, analyze the data, and most importantly, act on those results. Here are some sample clients. So over the last 17 years, we've helped hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations improve employee engagement using surveys. And as a result, we have comprehensive benchmarks to show for it. We are a member of Insights Association, formerly CASRO, also SIOP, Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, which hold us to a high level of standards when conducting business. Additionally, we do a lot of work with the Conference Board, and we've been recognized as an industry leader by several groups. Now that you know a little bit more about us, I will pass the presentation on to Sean.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks for the quick overview of the company. As Stephen mentioned, what I'm going to do is just really walk you through the process of running particularly an employee survey or focused in on an employee survey. As Stephen mentioned, we do a lot of work on employee engagement, but this method and 7 steps we're going to walk through are really probably applicable to almost any type of primarily employee survey, almost any survey in general, but I'm going to try to focus a little bit on that. So whatever tool you're using, whether it's an in-house tool, a third-party vendor, or even some TalentMap tools, hopefully you'll get a good overview of the things you need to think about at each stage in the process when you do run an employee feedback or an employee survey yourself. So again, focused on do-it-yourself type of approach. Before I do that, I do want to touch on a recent study. This is in Benefits Magazine. They went out and asked almost 200 human resource professionals about how they measure employee engagement. They found is about 66%, 2/3, and that's been pretty consistent for the last number of years, measure it on an annual employee survey. That makes a lot of sense, and we see that a lot in organizations. One area that we're seeing more of are pulse-style research. So shorter, maybe 1 question, 3 or 4 questions, 5 questions. So these pulse-style research, and about 23% of organizations are using that to measure engagement. That's something that's grown over the last number of years. If you went and did this survey, for example, of readers or of respondents in HR about 5 years ago, pulse-style research for measuring engagement would have been much lower. About 16% don't measure anything at all, and I think that's a problem. And then there's a couple or a handful that do it either every couple of years or is part of some other platform, whether it's a recognition platform or peer recognition platform that engagement is sort of tied in together with. So still the vast majority are through annual employee surveys with pulse surveys coming up. And that's why the do-it-yourself approach, we're seeing more and more of clients doing that. One is, I think, people are understanding surveys and the survey process better. You're seeing it used more frequently. So human resource professionals or those who are leading surveys are getting more comfortable about the steps that have to go on, or at least starting to get more comfortable. And that's what I really want to touch on today, is what are those steps? What are things to think about at each of the key stages? And then what are things that could possibly go wrong? So just sort of help you think about, if you're running your own survey, how do you manage the potholes that you might run into as you go through the process. So I'm going to walk through our 7-step process. So the next about 2 slides per stage, and starting from step 1 all the way through to step 7. First slide is really around 2 or 3 key things you should be aware of at that stage of running your own survey, and then likely pitfalls, which is on the second slide of each of the 7 steps that you might run into. So when we work with organizations, typically we go through the 7-step process, but really it's a process that almost any time you run a survey, whether we're doing it or you're running it in-house, you're probably following this. You may not have articulated exactly in this way, but you're probably going through this process. Anything from the very first step, which we call prepare for action, and that's really getting the executives and the logistics component, and they're 2 very different aspects, and I'll touch on those in a bit. Then it's getting into developing the questionnaire. What questions are we going to ask? How are we going to ask them? Step 3 is around pre-survey communication, and that's really around promoting the survey. One thing you certainly don't want to do is just throw a survey out there without having employees and managers aware of it. I'm going to touch on deployment and things to think about while you're deploying your own survey. Analyzing the data, what are key steps around that, and how it ties back into a little bit questionnaire design. Talk a little bit about sharing and reporting the results and rolling out the results, and then finally steps you should think about around communication and action planning. So those are what I'm going to walk through, and then hand it back over to Stephen near the end of the webinar for him to wrap up a little bit. So let's jump in, and the very first step from that circle that we just looked at is prepare for action. And that really involves a couple of key components. The most important component is really around getting CEO and in particular executive buy-in. Without CEO and executive buy-in, we find most surveys, particularly employee engagement surveys, can fall on flat ears. And that is because an employee survey is really not a research project as such, or even a survey project, but it's really a change management initiative. And by going out and asking employees and managers, what do we do well, what do we don't do well as an organization, what could further engage you as an employee, what disengages you as an employee, you're going to come up with all kinds of things that can touch the organization, maybe at a local level that could be easily fixed by a team or a frontline manager. But you'll also identify very broad reaching initiatives that could affect how the organization runs, how the leadership is organized, how the structure of the organization. So it's really a change management process. And so it touches so much of different aspects of the organization. Making sure that the executive are bought in is a real key component. Other aspects is how do you prepare for their objections, setting goals, looking at who does what, and just being cognitive of the resources you need. So whenever you're running a survey, the first step, before you even get into questionnaire, is really looking at these aspects. And I'm going to just go through a few of them in a minute on step 1. Before I touch on these about executive buy-in and challenges if you don't get that, one of the things that we often notice when organizations do it themselves is they jump right to the questionnaire. What questions should we ask? How should we ask these questions? Here's a sample questionnaire we should go with. And that's a little bit too early. That's really step 2. The very first step, and this is often overmissed by a lot of people when they run their survey in-house or they do it themselves, is they don't take the time to understand what is it that drives the executives and how you can start to link the survey back to the business, and that is what really ensures a successful survey. So if you don't get executive buy-in, a couple of things that can come up. First of all, you could get very serious objections, not to deploying the survey. Objections won't happen when they deploy the survey. The objections or the stonewalling or not being engaged in the process often happens in the action planning. When you start to expect that your leaders will take these survey results and actually start to drive change in their individual departments, they're much less likely to do that if they don't feel that they have been brought into the process and there wasn't sufficient buy-in throughout the process. So that's probably one of the biggest gaps that we hear when we talk about struggles when people do it themselves as well. We didn't have the right level of executive buy-in or management commitment. And our approach, or what we're recommending for those who are out doing themselves, is take the time to meet with the executives, to explain what you're trying to achieve from a business objective and how the survey fits into that. Don't start with the questions, start with what they're trying to achieve, and then start to design the questionnaire around that. The other thing is making sure that you take the time on the executive buy-in process to lay out the plan about how you will go about communicating your survey results once the survey results are in, and how you'll start to cascade the results down and start to generate action plans. One of the challenges a lot of organizations struggle, again, when they do it themselves, is they say, well, we'll decide on what we're going to do when the results come in. And that's okay, but it's not effective. Meaning what happens is, if the results are good, great, easy to share the results. But if the results aren't so good, which happens much of the time or in some parts of the organization, there becomes a lot of holdback of the data. So working with the executive ahead of time to talk about the rollout process and the post-survey communication process and the action planning process before the survey even goes live or designed is a very key step, because two things. One is it starts to create the expectation for the executive as to what they've got to do and not do around the follow-up, and it also ensures that that the executive are likely to use the results to drive change when it comes in, so the commitment's a lot higher. So that's the first point, making sure that you take the time to get the executive on board, understand what they're doing before you go to the questionnaire. Find out what their objections are, what their issues are, and remember, often when working with the executives, silence is often deadly, meaning you might have 6 or 7 or 8 people around the executive table, the CEO and the direct reports, and if you have 2 or 3 of them talking, some agree, some don't agree, but if you have, let's say, your chief operating officer or someone in charge of a large group doesn't say anything, you really want to understand if there are serious objections. Maybe they've had a bad experience with an employee survey in the past and they don't want to go down that road again. So understanding not just those who talk about the survey if they like it, but those who don't say anything. So a couple of things to focus on that executive buy-in up front. And Steve will probably mention at the end, Stephen will mention at the end about some of our tools that we have on our blog that gives you more ideas on how to create higher levels of executive buy-in. Second step in the process, that 7-step process that I laid out, is the survey design. And of course, you know, everyone wants to go to the questionnaire first, but understanding the business is first. And then you get to this aspect, which is questionnaire design. A couple of key things, of course, length of survey. How long of a survey should you have? Assuming it's a full survey, and I'll talk briefly about full and pulse because they're the ones that are most used most frequently. How often should you survey? So that's often a question coming up when you're running. Should you do it every 2 years, every year, every 6 months, every month? What should it be? The science of questionnaire and item design, I think that's important. Understanding that there's lots of great survey tools out there, but making sure if you're running your own survey that you think about validity and reliability, and I'll touch on that. And the last thing is around languages. You know, often, particularly in Canada and the United States, we're working with very diverse workforces where often English is a second language. So thinking through your workplace or your workforce and who are the brunt of the employees and what language are they comfortable in. So let me just touch on a couple of things. What could go wrong if you don't think about these things as you go through surveys? So one is, if it's a full survey, meaning a full comprehensive survey, the length of time that you want to use is not more than about 20 minutes. We find that employees will happily complete anything up to about 20, maybe 25 minutes in a survey without significant drop-off rates. Once the drop-off rates once it gets over 30 minutes, people tend to not complete the survey as frequently. So that's an important aspect. Now, if you have a longer survey, you can, of course, have save features where you can make and save and come back. But again, that affects response rate. They tend to tend to go down. One of the things to fix that, or to maintain, you can manage the response rate, is having your clear objectives in mind. And that, again, goes back to the discussion you'd have with your executives. And don't stray too far. One of the tools that we have, and we often encourage, is what we call a survey charter, which is a very simple one-page description outlining what is important to the executives, what the purpose of the survey is, and what's in the survey and what's out of the survey. That way, when you're starting to design a survey in-house or looking for survey questions, you're going to find often people come out of the woodwork and start to want to use this survey as an opportunity to collect information. So you'll get the safety and health and safety group come and wanting to ask safety questions. You might get the diversity group wanting to ask diversity and inclusion questions. And they may be the appropriate questions, or they may not be the appropriate questions. So understanding the objections and writing those down in a very simple one-page survey charter, we often call it, can help you keep that survey focused and not get it into too long of a time frame. Just a little tip on survey design. It's usually, if it's a radio button question, most surveys, employee surveys, are on a 5-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. However, you can use different scales, like a 3-point scale, 4-point scale, 5-point scale, 7-point scale, 10-point scale. There's not a one-size-fits-all. However, the most common scale out there used on employee surveys is a 5-point scale. Scientifically, the best scale is actually a 7-point scale. However, the difference between respondents on a 7-point scale to a 5-point scale is very minimal, and there's some practical uses of a 5-point scale. It fits better on a screen, it fits better on a tablet, an iPhone. So the difference is not significant between a 5 and a 7, and practically it's much easier for a respondent to complete. So that's some things around survey design that's important. The other interesting thing around a 5-point scale is you can also often get benchmark data, because most questions are asked on a 5-point scale. So if you're looking to compare and you're running your survey in-house, one of the gaps you might have is you won't have benchmark data. And that's sometimes really helpful, particularly for organizations that are running the survey for the first time. If you do ask it on a 5-point scale, there's a likely chance that you can find benchmark data out in the marketplace, either online, and give you some sense of comparison. If you use a 4-point or a 3-point or a 7-point, it'll be much, much harder to find comparative data in your industry that maybe be published or that's out there. The other side, I think, around how frequently should you survey. What we've noticed, most organizations, if they're doing themselves, they'll survey once a year, or often they'll survey once every couple of years because they just don't have a discipline around it. We've noticed that annual surveys seem to work best because managers get used to it, executives get used to it, or often, if it's a large organization and it takes time to change a large organization, they'll do a survey every 2 years, but then supplement the survey with short pulse surveys. I'm not going to, we did a webinar on pulse surveys, and there's some content on our site about pulse surveys. I'll just briefly touch on those. They're generally between 1 and 10 questions, and they're sent out to their subset of the whole population on very short, limited responses of what they want. And so pulse surveys could be done as a supplement to the frequency to improve monitoring without increasing the expectation. The other thing I'm going to touch on is around the science. It's important that you take the time to think through the design of your questionnaire. There's 2 key components whenever you design a good questionnaire that will allow you to do good analysis. 2 components are the validity and reliability, you know, the actual psychometrics, and the other one is making sure you build in dependent and independent variables or questions. A dependent variable in an engagement survey is usually your engagement index. So that's the variable you're measuring, but you're also trying to predict changes in that variable. And the way you predict changes in that variable is through asking independent variable questions like teamwork, senior leadership, compensation, work-life balance. All of those things are designed in a way to measure themselves as well as their impact on engagement. So thinking through how your questions are designed and the relationship of the individual items or questions to each other. Some should be independent variable, some should be dependent variable. So taking the time to think that. One of the best ways to test practical ways to test a survey that you've designed in-house is just run it, not with yourself, it's important to run it yourself before you send it out, but actually send it out to a handful of people that haven't seen the survey already. So we call them just simple testing and making sure that how they complete, they understand the question, the design, and then refining any of that. So taking that time, that extra few weeks or week or two ahead of time to actually create the questionnaire, send it out to a small sample of 5-10 people, and that way you'll get feedback as to the actual design. Does it make sense? Does it work in your organization? And so on. So those are some of the key things that that you should be thinking about. And then the last thing around translation. In countries that have lots of different populations, different languages, translating can often alter the meaning of the question. So not only looking at the best way to translate a question is actually you take the original version, let's say it's in English, you translate it to French, and then you have a separate translator that French translation back into English. And a well-translated question, that final translation back into English should actually match the translation or the original English that came out. Often it doesn't, but making sure you just think about translation in there. The third step of the 7 steps, so about halfway through here, is around spreading the word, making sure before the survey goes out that you take the time to think through a communication plan and you promote the survey. What you should be expecting when you run a survey, particularly an employee survey, is at least an 80% response rate. We typically see in clients out there anything from a 70% to a 90%. Those are good response rates with an average at 80. That's what you should be looking for. There are a few anomalies. Healthcare is one anomaly that tend to have a little bit lower response rates. Physicians tend to be much lower at that 40% response rate. And nursing or medical staff tend to be in around 60%. But almost every other industry, you should be in that 70 to 90 with an average of 80%. So that's a number you should be thinking about around response rates. If you don't take the time, there's a couple of things that can happen. One thing, if an employee or manager, a survey just pops into your inbox, you don't know why it's there, where it's coming from, how it's going to be used, confidentiality, you tend not to complete it. So taking the time to describe to employees and describe to managers how the survey data is going to be used, how you're going to communicate the results after they complete the survey. So those are 2 key components. And in particularly, one of the biggest challenges of doing it in-house is the fact that employees, rightly or wrongly, feel that human resource or whoever's running the survey are going to be able to identify their individual responses. So taking the time to explain how their survey results are going to be used, how it's going to be communicated, and how individual responses will or will not be provided back will go a long way to helping you get higher response rates when running the surveys in-house. And then the other thing is taking the time to promote the survey. Real successful companies around it actually have branding around their survey. They'll actually have their own brand, their own marketing around the survey for larger organizations. But one of the things, that successful organizations that do when they do it in-house is, they put up posters in lunchrooms prior to the survey. They send out initial emails to staff and to managers prior to the survey, just promoting the survey, talking about it, explaining how it's going to be used, maybe listing some frequently asked questions that might come up, and we have those again on our website if you wanted to see more details as to what typical questions people will ask when running the survey in-house. So taking a bit of time to promote the survey, but also clearly communicate what common questions and objections and concerns your staff will have around completing the survey. Probably the biggest one is just lack of trust that their individual responses will not be seen by someone at management. So making sure that you keep that in mind prior to the survey and communicating that out. Step 4 is launching the survey. So you notice there's quite a bit of work gone on beforehand, making sure we had executive buy-in, taking the time to think through questionnaire design and putting a little bit of science into it, and then promoting the survey. So usually if you're running your survey in-house, there's probably a month to a 6-week lead time for step 1, 2, and 3. So before you even launch the survey, you should be 2 to 3 months out thinking about it, planning on it. It's not something you come up with one week and launch the next week. Well, you can with today's tools, but the chances of success are probably much, much lower. So launching the survey, what I want to cover is just different ways to complete a survey, a range of tools out there, time periods, and then just a little around building response rates during the survey launch. So just a little bit around the tools out there. So think a little bit around the types of tools you have available to you in terms of completion. Most surveys are done online today, and when I say online, PC or Mac, a lot now are done by smartphone or tablet. Occasionally, we'll still see some paper surveys. Right now, for example, working with a mining company and a large number of paper surveys. Another organization we're working with is a technology company, but they also have facility management, so some people on paper there. And we're working with this technology company where they have warehouse and distribution. What we're doing is setting up kiosks in the different warehouse and distribution areas. So lots of different tools, but the majority of time people are completing it online and via smartphone. When you're talking about online, there's actually 2 ways to do it. You could have a unique link or PIN for that employee, so that actually you can there link their data to other metrics that you might be tracking, performance management metrics, compensation metrics, learning and development metrics. So one of the trends is taking survey results and linking it to other metrics to get a better prediction about what this data means. So having a unique link for each employee is one approach. A second approach is having an open link. That's often done with in-house surveys because of the tools and technology aren't always set up properly to have a unique link. That means anyone could go to the website and complete the survey, and typically you have to ask demographic information in this method, meaning you have to ask what department people are in, how long they've been with the organization, and so on. The unique link approach, you don't have to ask that. You already have that information in a separate database. You just link their survey responses through the unique link to the demographic data that you already have on these individuals. An open participation, you don't have demographics for whatever reason. Maybe you don't have good information on the employees, or it's just not organized that way. So you have to actually ask them what department they're in, what level of management they are, so for analysis of the data. The drawbacks of asking them through the online process, open process, is twofold. One is about a small percentage will, by mistake, put themselves in the wrong department. I'll give you a perfect example, marketing department. Let's say I'm part of the admin group, but I sit in the marketing department. When it asks what department am I in, I say marketing, but actually I'm part of maybe the corporate services group. So that's an example where you go then back to present the results to the marketing manager, and you say, oh, here's your results of your 15 people, and the marketing manager looks at you sort of questionably and say, well, I only have 11 people in my group. Why do I have 15? Well, because some people mistakenly put themselves in the wrong group. The other problem is they can sabotage the results. If they're not happy or there's a lot of cynicism in the organization, an open link, people can go in and by purpose put themselves in the wrong department and then try in a method or a way to sort of sabotage the results. More and more, though, today, instead of paper, just when we look at that, we're seeing even in environments where people are out in the field, where traditionally it was paper, now we're seeing smartphones and tablets. So one of the things, even though I don't touch on it on the previously, is whenever you design your survey, making sure it's designed both for a PC Mac environment, but also making sure in testing it actually can be completed on a smartphone or tablet. Taking that time to do those tests, viewing it on your smartphone, viewing it on your BlackBerry, or whatever device that is most common in your organization, and that it's legible. Particularly populations that used to do it by paper tend to be populations that are a little bit older, and they tend to have poor eyesight. So making sure that a screen on obviously a phone, you have to serve the surveys up with one question per screen, unlike an online PC or Mac where you might have 4 or 5 questions per screen. So making sure that the software you're using allows for that flexibility around design. The other thing I want to just touch on briefly around launching the survey is the length of time. A lot of time, how long should a survey be open for? We recommend most surveys on employee sites should be open for about 2 weeks. That's usually enough time to get to that 80%, and that gives you a sort of a focus or an urgency around that time frame. And you can often extend your 2 weeks to 3 weeks if you need to around holiday time and vacation. That's fine. But if you leave a survey open for a month, you tend to have much lower response rates than if you have a focused time to complete it over 2 weeks. So that's something that's important. And then finally, often people, when you're running them in-house, you might be dealing with low response rates. So how do you deal with low response rates? In addition to promoting the survey that I talked about earlier in step 3, these are some of the things you could do. In-person launch meeting where you actually bring everyone together at the beginning of the day, tell them we're launching the survey, say for the next 15 minutes or 20 minutes when you go back, look for the email, complete the survey, and that helps drive up response rates. Email countdowns. As you get through your 2-week period, sending out reminder emails to everyone or everyone who haven't completed the survey if you have that technology in your software. So that way people can actually know, oh, I got 5 days left, I got 4 days left, 3 days left, and that drives up response rate. Having managers literally walk around. So one of the things is to be able to generate a response rate, not their scores, but who's completed the survey by department or by team, giving those managers their scores or their ranking and say, hey, we got 3 departments, the marketing has a 70% response rate, finance has a 20% response rate, operations has an 80% response rate. All of a sudden that finance manager is going to look at how he stacks up against or she stacks up against the other managers and say, oh, I better go out and promote the survey to my staff. So giving a little friendly competition between managers by promoting or publishing their team's response rate to everyone is a great way to drive a little friendly competition. And this is not on their scores on good, high or low engagement. This is just on percentage of people who completed the survey. Company contests are great. Departmental contests are very, very helpful. And if you need to put money, sometimes a charitable donation. So, if we hit over 70% or over 80% response rate, we'll donate, $5, $1, $10, or the company will donate, per completed survey. So depending on your size of organization, that often is a nice benefit because employees feel, oh, I should complete it because it'll help with a donation. 5 out of the 7 steps now in terms of analyzing results. So after you've promoted, launched the survey, collected the results, now you have to sort of look at it, what's it all mean, and how do I take all this data and put it into that makes sense. One of the biggest challenges we notice, particularly for those who are running in-house surveys and doing it themselves the first time, is the massive amount of data a survey actually generates. So one of the surprising things we hear is, wow, I didn't realize there was so much information or so much data. So being prepared for that and having the resources or tools or capabilities to take the data out of a database and being able to manipulate that data, whether it's in Excel or some other software tool, can be helpful in addition to viewing on the online reports. So I'm going to touch on how to create meaningful data through results very briefly, how to deal with comments, and then just thinking about the data in the context of the business is always very important. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but not tying the data back to the business objectives is probably one of the most common problems. You get your results back, there's so much data, how do you interpret it, how do you understand it? Going back to the survey charter I talked about earlier, and then starting to think about how does these results drive what's most important to the executives based on the executive discussions and challenges that we talked about earlier. That allows you to start to look at the survey in light of the business, not in light of how the responses came in. So that's an important mindset to have whenever you're looking at survey data, because there's lots of information that can be pulled out of this. Some of the real simple things is, of course, rank your questions positive to least positive, and look for themes and connections. When you look at your highest scores, are they all around work-life balance? Or if you look your lowest scores, are they all around leadership, or are they scattered throughout? So that type of just a simple ranking is a very good step. Identify the drivers of engagement and using the right statistical analysis. So this depends on the survey design. So you should have a dependent variable and an independent variable. That's an important step to be able to do driver analysis. So that way you can do what we call correlations, and that correlation is starting to look at how different questions relate to each other. Again, Excel is often can do simple correlations, or two-item correlations. So you can actually compare an engagement score versus a teamwork score and you could actually run this in Excel. So very simple tools to do that. If you don't have, most survey software don't have that capability to do it online. So you'd run something like that. You get a scatter plot. This is your engagement, high versus low. This is your teamwork, low versus high. And you can start to look for some kind of pattern in the data. So that identifies then what's more important to employees between the questions. Not all questions are the same, and not all the low-scoring questions are the ones to work on. I'll give you an example. Almost every survey that's ever run around employee feedback, if you ask around compensation, I pretty much guarantee you will have low scores on compensation. But that doesn't mean they're the ones you should focus on. So focusing on the lowest scoring item is not the most important. Focusing on the combination of relatively low scores and high importance to employees through a key driver analysis is really critical. So that helps you identify what's most important to the employees and then linking it back to the business. If you have any benchmark results, whether it's you've done surveys over a period of time, doing that comparison is, of course, really helpful. And then the most common comparisons, of course, is starting to segment the data out. Most times it's done by department or by location. So department or function, geography is another one, and then tenure or years of service is another one. So those are some of the key things. The last aspect around is to compile the comments. If you're a small organization, reading through the comments and looking for themes is a very helpful tool to do around the comments. And if you're a bigger organization, there's better and better software out there that looks, when I'm talking big, thousands of employees, looking at comments is helpful in terms of that. Always keeping in mind the context of the business. So we often, the best organizations or best analysis of survey data is when you look at what the survey says. So this is what what does the survey say? And then you also marry that with what we call management appetite. What is it that the management is interested in working on, or is bugging them or bothering them? This is the executive team. And that is based on the very first step that we talked about, the executive buy-in. So if you understand what's important to the management, is it customer service? Is it innovation? Is it teamwork? And what does the survey said? That's where really it becomes meaningful, when you can start to look at the survey results that align with what's interesting to management and talking about those results. That's when you're more likely to get that action. That is so critical in any survey process that you run. Second last step is really just reporting results. I'm going to talk very briefly about that and then get into a little bit into action planning. One of the things is what type of reports to generate. Again, as I mentioned, lots of data comes out of that. So thinking through how you want to report. Do you want to have a report at a very high level, just the CEO or the VP level, and just maybe 5 or 6 reports, one for each VP and his or her department? Or do you want to roll results right down so you actually have reports right down to the frontline staff. So thinking about the level of reporting is important. What we recommend, or what we see the best organizations doing if they're doing it in-house, is they start small. The first survey they might do would be just to share the results with the executive team and that same report with all of the employees, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you don't necessarily create additional reports by VP, by director, by manager, by team lead, because that becomes almost overwhelming. In subsequent surveys, you might do that. Rolling out the results is really critical. How do you share the results? How do you roll the results out? Best tip here is typically you cascade it. So you start with the senior leadership team, you share that with them, then you maybe share it with the different departments or functions, and then you share that with their different teams within that function. Couple of ways to do that. If your organization has a strong management team, you can actually get managers to actually share that as a group. If they don't have a strong management team, meaning they don't understand how to use survey results, how to share survey results, how to facilitate discussions like that, you're going to have to step in as a HR professional or survey professional to help them share the results, not just with the leaders, but the rest of staff. And when I say skills, there's skills around just interpreting the statistics and understanding that, but also skills in learning how to share good information as well as bad information. Surveys give you both. They give you what's working in the organization, but they also give you what's not working in the organization. And one of the bigger challenges when you run it in-house is making sure you're prepared for those tough competition or conversations. When you get results that shows the leadership or the CEO have really low scores, keep in mind you're going to have to go back to that CEO and talk to them about those low scores. Or maybe it's really low scores in a particular department. So being able to be very honest about the challenges in the organization becomes very, very critical. And that's something that a very skilled HR professional can absolutely do, but it's something that you want to be thinking of. Finally, I'm going to just touch on some do's and don'ts on rolling out results. So one of the biggest things around taking results, if you don't take the time to understand how you're going to roll it out, is your organization structured and how they read the results? Is it mainly by function? Is it mainly by geography? So, for example, a large company that's fairly central, that may be an association, the key functions or departments might be important. You might have advocacy, government services, member services, and so on. Or a high-tech firm, you might have operations, science, research and development, marketing, and so on. Other organizations, geography might be the key cut. So a restaurant chains, for example, you have a general manager at each one of the location. You'll probably want to have a report for each one of the restaurants or each one of the general managers at each of the location. So it really depends on how you're structured as an organization, and there's very, very key differences between different industries out there. Of course, level in the organization, looking at what do the executives and managers say in terms of their view of the organization in terms of responses to the survey, mid-level managers, and frontline staff. So being able to cut the data by different ways, and again, this goes back to survey design, taking the time to think through the reporting which impacts the survey design. And then years of service. You want to look at, are millennials different than baby boomers in our organization, different than traditionalists, and so on. So thinking through the tenure in there is really critical. One of the things that often happens when you run the survey in-house that you should guard against is not sharing the results out in a consistent way. So what happens, you get the results back, they go to the executive team, maybe the results are great, that's good. Often the results are maybe not what they hoped, or there was some surprises in there, and they tend to get into paralysis by analysis. They want to look at the data, cut it by this way, cut it by that way. What if we presented the results? And managers and CEOs often want to not share the results because they feel that it may not represent it, the timing was bad in the survey, and so on. What we found is making sure, and this goes back to the executive buy-in and survey charter, to talk to them up front about how to share the results, when to share the results, and get a commitment there. We found that if you don't share the results within about 30 to 60 days of the close of the survey, people's or employees' interest in the response starts to die. They're not interested in seeing the survey response. However, they are still very interested in seeing you take action from the survey. So you have a window of about 2 to 3 months after the close of the survey to share the results out. The best organizations have been shown that not only do they share results, but they also share the actions that they plan to do as a result of that. So taking the time to cascade the results, typically starting with the executives, then sharing it with the managers, then with the employees, and you can do it in 2 ways. One is you can have the survey team or the survey lead, who are experts in the survey, present at all 3 levels. Another way is you have HR present to the executive, and then you get the VPs to learn and own their individual department data, and they share the results out with their individual departments. And then the teams or local managers learn their department results, and then they share it out with their local department. So 2 ways to approach it. If it's your first time, usually we recommend HR does it or the survey team does it. If you're getting more sophisticated, having the managers start to take ownership for communicating and cascading results out is a very effective process. I'm going to wrap up here with just some step 6 and step 7, just a couple of slides, and this copy of these slides I know will be available on our website. Just a couple of things around reporting results. Here's some of the don'ts. Don't try to figure out who said what. That's something that managers tend to want to do, and you really want to guard against that. Don't play the blame game. If the scores are low, don't try to say, well, it's because of X or it's because of Y. The scores are the scores. They really should be looked at as an opportunity to improve. And instead of saying our scores are bad or it's a real problem, often couching it's an opportunity. Now we know where we stand. How do we go about getting better? And that's often very helpful, is how you phrase it to your management team. Over-examining every question. Surveys are fairly blunt items because you're asking people's perception on a 5-point scale. You're getting information that helps act as a catalyst for better dialogue and discussion going forward. But trying to slice and dice and look at every individual question can actually lead to that paralysis by analysis mindset. And just keeping in mind that surveys are effective and they're blunt and they're cost effective to collect information, but they're not the end all and be all. You should go beyond that through further dialogue and discussion. The other problem, don't start to jump in and take the results and start to make changes. Oh, we got the survey results, we should change the comp, or we should change how we communicate. What we recommend is taking time to actually have further discussions with managers and employees inside your organization to further validate what they said, because you could misinterpret or misunderstand the results, and that through that validation process, be able to understand how to create action. So don't be so quick to rush to action planning. And then finally, don't try to bite off more than you can chew. We recommend, and we've seen the best organizations following up on survey results by picking 1 or 2 items that the organization can work on. And that's it. Not 5, not 10, but 1 or 2 items that make a lot of sense. Do show lots of visibility around and consistent support for the survey process. Again, going back to the importance of buy-in. Focus on the big issues. As I mentioned, lots of survey data comes out of your survey. The question is how do you synthesize that down to the key issues? And then share the results out, good, bad, and ugly, with everybody. That leads to an open, transparent culture, which leads to more honesty and comfort level around the leadership and the culture, and creates a much better survey process overall. Finally, step 7 is a couple of key things. On the left-hand side, this is an example. This is out of our Dummies, Employee Engagement for Dummies book that I think Stephen will talk about. But this is sort of how do you roll out results, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. Things you should think about as you're rolling out your survey results and where you should be at each one of those stages. So that's a sort of a guideline, and every organization is different. One of the important steps around developing action plans can be to use discussion groups or focus groups. So taking the survey results, not jumping to action, but validating those results with managers or employees, either in larger workshops or smaller focus groups, can be very effective. And then taking the feedback from those, categorizing them and prioritizing them, and then starting to put action plans in place. So taking the time to put resources into and thinking through an action planning process. The reason why we talk about that, the survey itself and the survey reports often is where organizations stop or start to fall off. They don't really consider that the survey is not an end to itself. It's really a first step in the process. It's the actions and the action planning that really becomes a critical component in terms of that. So a couple of bullets around that, what could go wrong around not planning effectively around action planning, biting off more than you can chew. If you're trying to examine and drive engagement, if that's the variable you're measuring, it could be safety, it could be diversity, but in this case I'm focusing on engagement. Identifying, using the data and the analysis, the 2 or 3 issues that are most critical to whatever you're measuring, in this case engagement, and using your data to understand the why behind these issues, as well as using focus groups and discussion groups to understand the why. So that is an important step, and why we talk about focus groups or discussion groups or workshops is because it gives an opportunity for employees to engage in the process after the survey. As I mentioned at the outset, an employee survey is an effective tool, but it should be looked at as a change management initiative, not just as a survey process or survey tool. Last thing, could go wrong. You could not do the right analysis and you start to jump on or pick on things that don't have an impact on what you're trying to measure, in this case engagement. So making sure you take the time to ask the right questions, that the survey is designed properly, can really help go a long way to making sure when you get to action planning you're working on the right things. And then one of the biggest challenges or Achilles heel of a survey process is action plans. Often people are all excited after the survey, but they tend to fizzle out. And aligning the process with what you currently have, if you have a process, so if you have a quarterly review process, if you have a performance management process, embedding the action plans into your existing processes can go a long way, and building some teeth as an executive team. When I talk about teeth, assigning bonuses, compensation, rewards and penalties to particular initiatives or actions or processes that you want your managers to follow starts to put teeth into the action planning process. So it's not just around, here's your survey results, I hope you do something with it, but actually putting consequences in as a result of them doing something successful, and it could be process-related consequences, meaning you're not reliant on the outcome of a score, but you're reliant in giving them bonuses or penalties on the fact that they're following the process, meaning sharing the results out, developing actions, working towards that process of continuous improvement. If you don't have a existing process, our Dummies book, I'm not going to go into it now, has a great outline of approaches or frameworks to action planning and how you should be going about it, and it outlines 3 or 4 different approaches depending on your organization and where you are in the process. So finally, I just sort of, wrap up here before I flip it back over to Stephen. I just want to, what I try to encourage here, try to outline, is hopefully a bunch of ideas and tips to think about. I walked through a 7-step process that maybe not a lot of you have articulated that way, but you've probably followed that if you've run your own survey or thinking about running your own survey. And then once you've done that, making sure you have that level of buy-in and the executives. And then finally, developing out your actions by being very anal around asking these questions and making sure you get people's names taken down that decide to do actions based on the survey. So for example, who will be leading each initiative or action plan? Which manager or executive or team lead? How will you measure the results? How will leaders be held accountable for acting on the results? Will you use objectives that are attached to performance bonuses, and so on? So these are real critical things if you want to make success around your survey, not just to run a survey, but to actually use it to an organization. It's critical to think through some of these questions and have responses to these questions as we go. I'm going to just wrap up, give you a little bit of an overview of very briefly, of a tool we have. It's called TalentGate. More and more of our clients are using our tools to run their own surveys, and it's a great tool. We've had it out in the field now for about a year in beta and got great client feedback from it. Clients love it. You can ask a range of different surveys on it. You can analyze all kinds of data, and we're starting to build in more and more online support for action planning around there. So the tool itself is a software platform, software as a service. It has a survey builder. It has a deployment module. It has reporting. Everything's in the cloud. It can integrate with your HRIS, and we have great data analytics and text analytics in it. So we call it TalentGate, but if you're running your own survey or thinking of running your own survey and you're looking for a platform, we do have a very effective platform. However, as I mentioned, there are lots of good platforms out there. I think ours is fantastic, of course, but hopefully if those who do have software, you got some ideas, those who are thinking about it, feel free to contact us. We're happily to help with that aspect of your survey process. From that, I'm going to turn it now back over to Stephen, and I think Stephen just wants to wrap up here with a few additional resources.
All right, yeah, thanks, Sean. That was phenomenal. So we've been working really hard at TalentMap to provide some additional resources to our clients and followers. So we implemented a blog, and we've been posting almost daily. Lots of great articles, tips and tricks, industry trends, thought pieces. I put some examples here, do-it-yourself or outsourced employee engagement surveys. This one's good. It's a kind of continuation on today's topic. 10 key points to win executive buy-in. That one actually has a checklist you can download, an organizational employee engagement readiness checklist. So that's kind of a neat one. And then underneath that you have dollars and cents of employee engagement. Really neat. It has an employee engagement calculator built in, so you can go and calculate the costs and cost savings associated with employee engagement. Additionally, like Sean mentioned, we recently published a new book, Employee Engagement Action Planning for Dummies. You can go to our website, the link's here, and order it. We do charge for shipping. The book's for free, but we do charge for shipping. However, I've hidden a bunch of discount codes around our website, so you can go grab one of those discount codes, and that will waive the cost of shipping. So the more you engage with our content, the more likely you'll find one of those codes. And as a final note, like Sean mentioned before, a recording of this presentation as well as the slide deck will be posted on our website, and I'll be sure to email you directly to let you know when it's ready to go. And that's it for our presentation today. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll talk soon. Goodbye.